The day I found out my brothers had sold our childhood home, I was sitting in my tiny apartment eating instant noodles for dinner because I'd spent my last paycheck on my daughter's school supplies. My phone buzzed with a text from my oldest brother, Michael, and I remember thinking it was strange because we hadn't spoken in almost 2 years. The message was brief, almost casual, like he was telling me about the weather instead of destroying the last connection I had to our family. He said they'd found a buyer for the house on Maple Street, that the closing was scheduled for the end of the month, and that I should come collect whatever I wanted to keep before they cleared everything out. I stared at that message for what felt like hours, my noodles growing cold and congealed in the bowl, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The house on Maple Street wasn't just a building. It was where I had grown up, where my mother had taught me to bake cookies in the kitchen while my father worked in his study. It was where I had taken my first steps, where I had cried over my first heartbreak, where I had hidden in the attic reading books by flashlight when I couldn't sleep. It was the only home I had ever known, and my brothers had sold it without even asking me. I called Michael immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been expecting me, and I could hear the impatience in his voice before I even said a word. I asked him how they could do this, how they could sell our childhood home without consulting me, without even giving me a chance to buy it myself. He laughed, a cold, dismissive sound that cut through me like a blade. He said there was nothing to consult about, that I had never contributed anything to the family, that I had no right to an opinion. He said I had walked away from them years ago, that I had made my choice, and now I had to live with it. That was the moment I realized my brothers had never really seen me as their sister. They saw me as an inconvenience, a burden, a problem to be solved. And the house on Maple Street, the house that held every memory I had of our parents, was just another problem they wanted to get rid of. Before we continue, if you enjoy emotional family dramas, hidden truths, and unforgettable endings, subscribe to Life Tangle Secrets. Every story here reminds us that the truth always finds its way into the light. Let me take you back to the beginning, because I think you need to understand how I ended up in that tiny apartment, eating cold noodles, while my brothers dismantled the last piece of our family's history. I was the youngest of 3 children, and the only girl. My brothers Michael and David were 4 and 6 years older than me, respectively, and they made it clear from the time I was old enough to talk that I was an intruder in their world. They had each other, a bond forged through shared secrets and adventures, and I was just the annoying little sister who tagged along whether they wanted me to or not. Our parents tried to encourage closeness between us, but it never quite worked. There was always a distance, a sense that my brothers saw me as someone who didn't quite belong. My father was a carpenter by trade, a quiet, gentle man who found more comfort in woodworking than in conversation. He built our house with his own hands, every beam and every joint crafted with meticulous care. The house on Maple Street was his masterpiece, a 3-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch and a backyard that seemed to go on forever. He used to tell me that he poured his soul into that house, that every nail and every board carried a piece of his heart. And I believed him, because you could feel it when you walked through those doors. There was warmth there, and safety, and the kind of love that only comes from something built with your own 2 hands. My mother was the heart of that house. She was a school teacher, patient and kind, with a smile that could light up any room. She was the one who made birthdays special, who created elaborate Halloween costumes from scratch, who stayed up all night when one of us was sick. She believed in family above everything else, and she tried so hard to make us close, to bridge the gap between my brothers and me. But some gaps are too wide to be bridged, and some resentments run too deep to be healed. When I was 16, my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer. It came out of nowhere, aggressive and merciless, and he was gone within 6 months. The house on Maple Street felt empty without him, his workshop in the basement gathering dust, his favorite chair in the living room remaining perpetually vacant. My mother tried to hold us together, but grief affects people in different ways. My brothers retreated into themselves, Michael burying himself in his schoolwork, and David losing himself in a series of reckless relationships. And I, the youngest, tried to be strong for all of them, tried to fill the void my father had left behind. 3 years later, my mother followed him. She had a stroke in her sleep, peaceful and unexpected, and I woke up one morning to find her gone. I was 19 years old, barely an adult, and suddenly I was alone in a world that felt impossibly cruel. The aftermath of my mother's death is where the fractures in our family truly became unbridgeable. The house on Maple Street was left to the three of us equally, but my brothers had no interest in living there. They were both in their mid-20s by then, building careers and lives of their own. Michael was working as a financial analyst in the city, and David was completing his residency to become a doctor. They wanted to sell the house, to divide the proceeds and move on with their lives. But I couldn't let it go. The house was all I had left of our parents, of my childhood, of a time when our family was whole. I begged my brothers to let me stay, to let me keep the house, to give me a chance to make it work on my own. I told them I would pay them for their shares over time, that I would find a way to make it affordable. I was working 2 jobs, waitressing during the day and cleaning offices at night, and I knew it would be a struggle, but I was willing to do whatever it took. My brothers looked at me like I was insane. Michael said I was being sentimental and impractical, that a 19-year-old girl couldn't possibly maintain a house that size on her own. David said I was trying to manipulate them with emotion, that I needed to grow up and face reality. They made it clear that they didn't care about my attachment to the house. They saw dollar signs, and they wanted their money. In the end, I had to sign over my share of the house to them. I couldn't afford to buy them out, and I couldn't afford to fight them legally. The agreement was simple. I would walk away, and they would compensate me for my portion of the equity, a sum of money that seemed substantial to a 19-year-old, but was actually paltry compared to what the house was worth. I took that money and used it to rent the tiny apartment I still live in today, a cramped studio with a leaking faucet and a landlord who never fixes anything. My brothers washed their hands of me after that. They had their money, and they had each other, and they had no use for a younger sister who had been nothing but a complication in their carefully planned lives. I became the family secret, the one we don't talk about at gatherings, the failure who couldn't move on from the past. They went on to have successful careers and comfortable lives, while I struggled to make ends meet, always haunted by the memory of the home I had lost. Years passed, and I tried to build a life for myself. I went back to school, earning an associate's degree in accounting, and I found a stable job at a small firm. I met a man named Thomas, a kind, patient man who understood my grief and loved me despite my baggage. We got married, and a few years later, our daughter Emily was born. Life wasn't easy, but it was good. I had a family of my own, a family that loved me without conditions. But the house on Maple Street never stopped calling to me. I used to drive past it sometimes, just to see it, just to remind myself that it was still there. I'd sit in my car across the street and watch the shadows shift across the porch, remembering the summer evenings my father and I spent there, him teaching me about the constellations, me trying to memorize every star. I'd remember the way my mother's voice would carry from the kitchen, singing old show tunes while she prepared dinner. I'd remember a time when our family was intact, when love was something you could touch and hold. I never told my husband about those drives. He knew the house was important to me, but he didn't know the depth of my connection, the way it had become almost spiritual. I kept that part of myself hidden, even from him, because I was afraid that if I said it out loud, it would make me seem pathetic. A grown woman, a wife and mother, still obsessed with a house she'd lost nearly 2 decades ago. It was easier to keep it to myself. And then the text came, and everything I had buried came rushing back. After that phone call with Michael, I was in shock for days. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything. Thomas tried to comfort me, but he couldn't understand why I was so devastated. To him, it was just a building, a piece of real estate that had been out of my hands for almost 20 years. But to me, it was so much more. I needed to go back. I needed to see the house one last time before it was gone forever. I needed to say goodbye properly, to honor the memory of my parents, to find some kind of closure that had eluded me for so long. So I drove to Maple Street on a Sunday morning, when I knew my brothers wouldn't be there. The house looked different than I remembered. The white paint was peeling, the porch steps were weathered, and the garden my mother had tended so lovingly was overgrown with weeds. But it was still our house. I could feel my parents in every crack and crevice, in the creak of the front door, in the scent of old wood and faded memories. I let myself in with the key I'd kept all these years, the one my mother had given me when I was 12, telling me I was old enough to have my own key to our home. The inside was in even worse condition. The floors were covered in dust, the furniture was gone, and the walls were bare, stripped of every photograph and painting that had once given them life. My brothers had already begun the process of clearing everything out, and the house felt like a corpse, a body that had been picked clean by scavengers. I walked through every room, touching the walls, trying to absorb whatever memories I could. I went to my old bedroom, now empty and echoing, and I sat on the floor and cried. I cried for my parents, for my childhood, for the sister I used to be before grief made me hard. I cried for the family I had lost and the family I had never really had. I cried because I didn't know how to let go. And then, somehow, I ended up in my father's study. The room had been largely untouched, probably because my brothers didn't know what to do with his things. His old desk was still there, covered in a layer of dust, and his bookshelves lined the walls. I ran my fingers over the spines, remembering the way he used to read to me from these same books, his voice soothing and calm. I opened the desk drawers, looking for anything that might connect me to him one last time. That's when I found it. Tucked in the back of the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a pile of old tax returns and faded receipts, was a large manila envelope. It was sealed with tape and marked with my father's handwriting. For my daughter's eyes only. My heart stopped. I had no idea this envelope existed, no idea my father had left something specifically for me. I tore it open with trembling hands, and inside I found a document that changed everything. It was a deed, the original deed for the house on Maple Street. And on that deed, in my father's own handwriting, there was only one name listed as the rightful owner. My name. Not my brothers' names, not all three of us equally, just me. My father had changed the deed shortly before he died, transferring sole ownership of the house to me. He had done it quietly, without telling anyone, because he knew his sons would try to take everything from me. He had seen the way they treated me, the way they dismissed me and belittled me, and he had wanted to protect me. I read the document over and over, trying to process what I was seeing. My father had left me the house, the entire house. He had wanted me to have it, to be the one to carry on our family's legacy. And somewhere along the way, the deed had gotten lost, buried in the chaos of his death and my mother's. My brothers had assumed they owned equal shares, and I had assumed the same, and no one had ever checked. I had signed away a house I never should have signed away. I had let my brothers steal my inheritance because I hadn't known the truth. I sat in my father's chair, surrounded by his books and his memories, and I made a decision. I was going to fight for what was rightfully mine. I was going to honor my father's wishes, even if it meant tearing my family apart. If you've ever been judged, betrayed, or underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you, let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying this journey, subscribe to Life Tangle Secrets for more unforgettable stories. I hired a lawyer the next day. It wasn't easy, because lawyers are expensive and I didn't have much money. But I found a young attorney named Sarah who believed in my case, who saw the injustice in what my brothers had done, and who was willing to work on a contingency basis. We filed a motion to stop the sale of the house, and we presented the deed as evidence of my sole ownership. The legal battle was brutal. My brothers fought me every step of the way, hiring their own high-powered attorneys, trying to argue that the deed was invalid, that my father had been of unsound mind when he signed it, that I had willingly signed away my rights when I took the settlement many years ago. But my lawyer was good, and we had the evidence on our side. The deed was authentic, properly witnessed and notarized, and there was no evidence that my father had been anything other than in full possession of his faculties when he made the change. The judge ruled in my favor. The house on Maple Street was mine, free and clear, and any sale my brothers had attempted to arrange was null and void. My brothers were furious. Michael called me screaming, threatening to sue me for everything I was worth. David sent me a letter, cold and formal, explaining that he and Michael would never speak to me again, that I had destroyed the family, that I was a selfish monster who cared more about a house than about her siblings. I listened to their anger, read their words, and I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I wasn't desperate for their approval. I was finally free. I didn't go to the house for months after the ruling. I was too overwhelmed, too emotional, too afraid of what I might feel when I walked through those doors again. But eventually, I knew I had to face it. I drove to Maple Street on a crisp autumn afternoon, the leaves falling around me like confetti, and I walked into the house that had once been my father's dream. It was in terrible condition. My brothers had done nothing to maintain it, and years of neglect had taken their toll. But as I walked through each room, I didn't see the decay. I saw the potential. I saw what my father had built and what he had intended for me. I saw a future, not just a past. I decided to sell the house. I know that sounds contradictory after everything I'd been through, but it was the right choice. I had held onto the house for so long because I thought it was the only connection I had to my parents. But I had finally realized that my parents weren't in the house. They were in my memories, in my heart, in the way I raised my daughter and loved my husband. The house was just a building, and holding on to it was preventing me from moving forward. But I wasn't going to let my brothers profit from it. I sold the house to a young family who loved it as much as I had, who promised to restore it and fill it with laughter and love. And I took the money, the full value of the house, and I put it into a trust for my daughter, Emily. I wanted her to have something her father and I could never give her, a foundation, a safety net, a chance at a future unburdened by financial worry. I also set aside a portion of the money to donate to a scholarship fund in my parents' names. My father had always wanted to go to college but couldn't afford it, and my mother had spent her life teaching others. It felt right to honor them that way, to give other children the opportunities they never had. My brothers tried to contest the sale, tried to argue that they deserved a share of the proceeds. But they had no legal standing, and their threats were empty. I didn't give them anything. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I had finally learned that I didn't owe them anything. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their approval, trying to be good enough for them, and it had been a losing battle from the start. I haven't spoken to Michael or David in 3 years now. I don't miss them, which might sound harsh, but it's the truth. They never treated me like family, and I was tired of pretending otherwise. I have my own family now, a husband who loves me and a daughter who lights up my world. I have friends who support me and colleagues who respect me. I have a life that is full and rich and happy, and I don't need people in it who make me feel small. Sometimes I think about my parents and wonder what they would think of everything that happened. My mother, I think, would be heartbroken. She wanted her children to be close, to love each other, to be there for each other through thick and thin. My father would understand. He knew what his sons were like. He knew they would try to take everything from me. That's why he left me the house in the first place. I have the deed framed in my apartment now. It hangs above my desk, a daily reminder of the father who loved me enough to protect me even after he was gone. I look at it sometimes and I feel his presence, his warmth, his quiet strength. I feel his approval, his pride, his unshakable belief in me. The moral of my story, if there is one, is that the truth always finds a way to surface. It might take years, decades even, but it will come out eventually. My father knew that. He trusted that the truth would protect me, and it did. The deed he left behind was more than just a legal document. It was a testament to his love, a final gift from a father to his daughter, a way of telling me that I was never forgotten, never unloved, never alone. I also learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most can hurt us the deepest. My brothers and I share blood, but we don't share a heart. And that's okay. I've made peace with that. I've made peace with the fact that they will never be the siblings I wanted them to be, and I've made peace with the fact that I don't need them to be. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Life Tangle Secrets for more powerful stories where hidden truths become life-changing lessons. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.